Hey guys, Kenny Racebot here, coming at you with another video. This one is about the K100. What we're going to be doing is swapping out this old 6-rivet output shaft for a newer 12-rivet output shaft. So yeah, come along for the journey and we'll swap this out. There's a few reasons why you might want to change the output shaft on your K100. Earlier models of the K100 from 1982 to 1989 came with a 6-rivet output shaft. Normally this output shaft would not be an issue. However, as time went on, the 6 rivets became worn, producing movement between the drive gear and the shock absorber body. But the issues don't stop there. Some models would suffer from a worn anti-backlash spring, meaning that there would be movement between the anti-backlash gear and the drive gear. And additionally, both these issues would be compounded by a worn push drive. Internal rubbers could become hard with age and reduce the amount of cushioning between the output shaft and the absorber body. All this leading to a bike that sounds less than optimal during running, producing loud knocking noises and buzzing from the rear of the bike. Changing the output shaft on a K100 is not for the faint of heart. It does require some level of skill and a decent amount of tooling to be able to get this job done. However, I've put some links in the description below of some good articles and manuals as supplementary content to help you get this job complete. Definitely the easiest way to remove the output shaft is to have the motor separate from the frame, as this allows easier access to the underside of the bike. Firstly, remove the frame, the swing arm and gearbox from the bike. Once this is done, we need to remove the clutch housing. When you remove the clutch plates, you are left with these bolts, which will need to be replaced. However, we can use them to hold in our clutch tool. To remove the clutch center nut, you will need a special tool. This tool can be easily fabricated out of scrap metal, and the dimensions are as follows. As the clutch center nut is at a high torque value, we're going to use a 6-sided 30mm socket. The clutch center nut is a one-time use only part, so it will need to be replaced every time you loosen it. Once the center nut has been removed, you can slide out the clutch housing. Then removing the side cover from the engine, this allows you greater access to the intermediate flange. Using a T30 Torx bit, you can now remove the bolts holding in the intermediate flange. Once these bolts have been removed, you can now use a rubber mallet to gently remove the intermediate flange, being careful not to bend the locating pins at the top and the bottom of the case. Next, remove the idler shaft and gear along with its thrust washer, making sure to note its location and orientation. Next, remove the starter sprag clutch. This will come out in 2 pieces and look something like this. Once you've got the starter sprag clutch out, it's a good idea to give it a clean, as it's a common item on the K100 to fail. Then rotate the engine over so the oil pan is facing upwards. With the oil drained from this engine earlier, we can now begin to remove the bolts holding in the sump lid. With these bolts removed, a gentle tap from a mallet will release the gasket sealer's bond. Next, we will need to remove the oil and coolant pump. This pump is connected to the crankcase, oil sump and output shaft, so it will need to come out. It's a good idea to keep the pump's cover bolts separate, as there are different sizes from the internal bolts on the pump. Gently pry the cover from the housing, ensuring not to use excessive force. You can now remove the remainder of the 5 bolts holding the pump assembly in. It's now time to remove the pump. A gentle tap with a hammer will free any gasket sealer. Simply wriggle the pump until it's free of the block. Next, we will need to remove the sump. Simply loosen and remove the bolts holding the 2 assemblies together. Using a 6mm Allen key and a 14mm socket, remove the bolts from the front and rear of the output shaft. The sump and output shaft are now ready to come out. And again, we're gently using a mallet to separate the 2 assemblies. Gently wriggle the sump away from the engine block. At this point, the rear main seal will become free. Remove it so it doesn't become damaged. Simply lift the output shaft and sump free of the engine. Side by side, there are clear differences between the old output shaft and the new output shaft. The new output shaft on the right is from a 1992 K100. However, output shafts from 1989 onwards will feature this 12-rivet output shaft design. K1100s do also feature a 12-rivet output shaft, which are interchangeable with K100s. Before installing the new output shaft, make sure to clean the bearing surfaces with brake cleaner. This will ensure secure fitment with new flange sealant. After thoroughly cleaning the sump, we can now continue to fit the new output shaft. Apply a thin, even layer of gasket maker to the bearing surfaces. This will ensure the bearing outers do not spin once everything has been assembled. Here I'm using an anaerobic gasket maker designed specifically for aluminium components. We can now place the new output shaft into the bearing seats, making sure the front pinion bearing and circlip fit into their respective places. It's also a good idea to tap on the rear main bearing with a mallet to make sure it's seated correctly. At the engine block, repeat the same process by applying anaerobic gasket maker to the bearing surfaces. You can now apply a high temperature oil resistant RTV silicone to the bottom flange of the engine. It's now time to put the engine back together. Whilst placing the sump back on with the output shaft installed, make sure the teeth mesh with the gears below. You can now fit the bolts located at the front and the rear of the output shaft. Torque these bolts to the recommended values of 18 Nm for the front and 40 Nm for the rear. You can now tension down your oil sump bolts to 7 Nm, making sure to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. Once this is done, flip the engine so the output shaft is facing upwards. You can now add grease to the rear main seal's seating surfaces. It's also not a bad idea to add some oil to the output shaft's main bearing. Some models of K100 came with this plastic shim. If yours has it, then I would suggest fitting it now. Finally, grease the surface for the rear main seal to ensure the seal seats properly. You can now begin to install the new rear main seal. Whilst installing the new rear main seal, ensure that it goes in evenly on all sides. A correctly installed rear main seal will sit flush with the engine case and should not bind on the output shaft. You can now apply gasket sealer to the seat of the intermediate flange. Install the Sprag clutch along with the idle shaft, ensuring that the thrust washer is in the correct position. Sometimes this pinion gear can be hard to get in. Rotate it in a clockwise direction to get it to seat. With the final cog in place, make sure the teeth mesh and rotate freely. And as always, don't forget to refit any washers that may have been on the shaft. You can now fit the intermediate flange, making sure to align both top and bottom locating dowels. Tighten down these bolts using a T30 in a cross pattern. Using a torque wrench set to 9 Nm, tighten down the flange bolts in a cross pattern. Flipping the engine over once again, we can now continue to put the oil pan back together. Apply a new gasket maker and fit the lid back onto the sump. With the sump lid back in place, torque down these bolts to 7 Nm using a cross pattern. It's now time to fit the oil and water pump back onto the front of the engine. Apply a new gasket maker to the oil side of the pump, ensuring not to get it into the gears. Before fitting the pump back onto the motor, ensure that the output shaft is correctly fitted inside the pump. While sliding the pump into place, rotate the impeller to get it to correctly engage with the new output shaft. Tighten down the pump assembly using a torque wrench set to 7 Nm. You can now continue to put the lid back onto the water pump. With new gasket maker on the flange, you can now tighten these bolts down to 7 Nm. On the left hand side of the motor, we can put the crankcase back on. We need to make sure that the flange is 100% clean with no oil so that the new gasket can make a good seal. Where the casings meet at the front and the rear of the motor, you will need to apply a small amount of gasket sealer to ensure that the casings don't leak. You can now continue to install the right hand side cover. Once again, using a torque wrench set to 8 Nm, tighten these bolts down in a crosswise pattern. With the engine all sewn back up, you've now successfully changed the output shaft in your K100. So that pretty much does it for today, guys. That's how you change the output shaft on the K100. I believe after a certain new model, which I'll put on the screen right now, they did change to a 12 rivet output shaft, so this isn't really applicable for that. But if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment below, like and subscribe if you feel inclined to do so. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one, guys. Happy riding.
Oh,